Welcome to the Kitsap Literary Artists and Writers and its monthly author showcase. I'm your host, J.W. Capek, and author Stephanie Lile is with us this month at the Bremerton Kitsap Access Television Studios. Stephanie and I met at the Puyallup Festival of Books, signing for her novel, The Tail Gunner, about a spirit from World War II. She's a universal woman, and according to Stephanie's website, curiosity has driven her to be a writer, a teacher, an exhibit developer, a researcher, a ventriloquist, metaphorically speaking, open space advocate, an art lover, a museum educator, and an objectologist. Welcome to our broadcast for Kitsap Literary Artists and Writers, Stephanie.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Good, good. Did you always want a career as varied as a writer, a museum educator, and an objectologist?
Well, that's a good question. I started out wanting to be a designer, and people would say, what do you want to design? I'm like, well, I'm not really sure, but I know I want to design stuff. So I discovered that I was very good at designing exhibit spaces, graphic design, stories, because stories are designed in their own way, and the construct of a story, and finding the story has always been my passion. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of led me to finding the story of objects, finding the story of people. So really that process of finding the story and then finding a way to retell it has been kind of my entire career. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I was interested in your friend, and I practiced this name, Ernest Ogilvie Punkweiler, and his transition to a children's book, and then to a children's book, and then to a museum exhibit. Mm-hmm. Obviously, he's an influence on your life.
Well, yeah. I mean, I suppose you always encounter some character in your life that you wonder, well, what were they like? And so I had actually written an article for Columbia, an online kids journal that we had called Columbia Kids at the Washington State Historical Society. And while that online journal is no longer with us, that story started out as a story about a mummy that they have in the collection at the State History Museum. And it was written in a voice that was unlike my own. I'm like, where did this voice come from? And that's the thing with writing, you know, you find these voices and it's like, wow, this is kind of cool. And it couldn't be a story written by me, so it was this other person, and that other person turned out to be Dr. Ernest Ogilvie Punkweiler. And then I thought, what would he be like as a kid? And that's kind of where the exhibit idea came from. So we wanted to create an exhibit that people could actually put themselves into. And because photography is oftentimes frowned on in museums because of the nature of the delicacy of the artifacts, we wanted to create situations where people could literally become the object in the scene and take their own pictures and kind of play with that idea. So that's kind of where that story came from, is we created this whole environment that was Ernest Ogilvie Punkweiler's place that he finds, and the whole idea of being a keeper. So being a museum keeper is about caring about objects, caring about the preservation of what represents us now into the future 100 years, and what the people from, you know, thousands of years ago collected, saved, so that we could understand them better too. So that's kind of the whole idea of Ernest Ogilvie Punkweiler.
Well, how did Ernest change, though, to a book and then to the exhibit?
Well, it was the exhibit first, actually. So okay. The book, actually, I wrote the story, and it was just a draft story, but it was kind of the storyline for the exhibit. And so then we had the story that was an audio story that was in the exhibit, and people kept asking if they could buy the book, and we're like, well, we don't really have the book. So then I got together with my designers, and we said, could we make a book really fast? And anyone who makes books knows that books don't come along really fast. But we managed to put together a book, printed only 300 copies, so it's pretty rare, and was sold during the run of that exhibit for all those people that wanted to have the story.
Mm-hmm. Well, how did your, with a little time travel magic mm-hmm. and a tremendous amount of research, tell us about your novel, The Tail Gunner.
Well, The Tail Gunner is also really an object-based story. It's based on the collection that was found back in like 1996 from a tail gunner from World War II who never talked about the war, never really wanted to. Nobody really knew what his story was. And then after he had passed away, we were cleaning out the hayloft of the horse barn and taking things up to the burn pile in the pasture and found this huge box full of old photographs, letters, a diary. And I just began piecing together this story. And it was really the story of my dad, because the tail gunner was Keith Lile, my dad, and he went to war after graduating in 1941 and flew 59 missions in the back of a B-25. So that book took me to Italy, it took me to Arizona to fly in a B-25, and looking at all of these images of people, I didn't know who they were. It was really hard to identify a lot of the different pictures. And I just began to think about what would it be like if these characters or these people literally could come out of their photographs. And that's kind of what happens in that book.
Mm-hmm. And what genre would you say that book is?
It's young adult.
Young adult?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Because
it's a kind of mix, because I wanted to try something that is not conventional, which is the combination of sort of prose poetry with a novel. Mm-hmm. And so that posed its own challenges, because their poems are included as if they are the main characters, you know, from her sketchbook or writing book. And so they're very much angsty teen voice. And so it was an interesting challenge. I'm not sure I would do it again, but it was fun to try it for this book to see if it would work.
I was very interested in it because it brought in all these details about the war and the experiences that your tail gunner had, but it tied them to a young woman today and how she was finding out what the tail gunner went through. And I really saw the connection between that story of the tail gunner and this young woman who really wanted to know what had happened.
Yeah.
Since you've become the director of the Harbor History Museum in Gig Harbor, talk about the opening of the Bomber Boys exhibit. There it's on December 7th, 2018, and it's based again on the same collection as the Tail Gunner. So how did that become a museum piece?
Well, that story started out as nonfiction, then went to fiction, then went back to nonfiction, then ended up as fiction, because I just found that there were so many pieces of the story that I couldn't find the emotional connection to be able to tell that in a way that I felt was really important to tell it as a young adult novel. So it became a novel. The exhibit is really the nonfiction three-dimensional version of this whole story. So it's an exhibit that is based on a collection of photographs and ephemera and letters found, and then what we have done is we've actually tied it. The squadron turns out to be a squadron that was in the 57th Bomb Wing, which is the same bomb wing that Catch-22 is written about, and Joseph Heller was part of that bomb wing. And so it's one of the only exhibits that's out there that actually features that particular bomb wing. And so they were stationed on Corsica and then moved to northern Italy later in the war. And their whole mission was to bomb Brenner Pass, which was the primary supply line between northern Italy and Austria and Germany. And with the success of derailing trains, breaking down bridges, bombing marshalling yards and transmission stations, they were able to basically shut down the whole end of the war.
Well, your careers, and I say plural, include teaching as well as writing. Do you use storytelling as part of the teaching process?
Absolutely, I do all the time. When I teach like a cultural arts administration class, I usually start with the story Frederick and the mouse story. Is it Eric Carle who did Frederick? And it's about this mouse that's collecting colors and sounds and words, while all the rest of the mice are collecting food and things that will keep them warm during the winter. And the whole idea is that during the winter, when people are holed up in their little den, that all the words and the colors and everything that Frederick finds and shares with everyone makes the winter go by faster and helps them survive. And so the cultural arts are really very much like that. And working in a museum, we're collecting all of those things so that we can turn around and share them with other people, and people can learn from them, explore with them, be creative with them. So we do work with a number of writers who research various topics with the museum collection. So there's always a connection between all of this stuff. Yeah.
Well, Describe your writing process. Does it start with a question or with an answer? And how do you fill in the story in between?
Well, most of my writing starts with an object.
An
I will
object.
say, if you look at almost every story that I write, it has to do with an object or a story. We just recently did an exhibit called Salmon Seiners and Life on the Sea, and we did a retelling of a true story that's called So Many Fish. And it was based on the story of one of the Gig Harbor fishermen who was fishing up in the San Juans in the 1940s. And it was such a heavy salmon run that he just got overeager and overfilled his boat and then wound up sinking it off the shore of Cattle Point up in the San Juans. And then how 4 boats came back and lifted that boat off the bottom of the sound and hauled it back up to Friday Harbor. So these stories come from all over the place, but mostly inspired by some object that I'm curious about.
In addition to exhibits, which you're always interactive with, do you have some other book events coming up to discuss your writing?
No.
Okay.
Sorry. I'm so immersed in directing the Harbor History Museum, and it's a full-time plus job. So the writing that I do exhibit labels, I do research reports, I write a lot of grants. So that's kind of where my writing energy is going right now. Aside from the Bomber Boys exhibit, which will be at the Harbor History Museum, and then it will travel to Moses Lake, I may do a author presentation as part of that, but it's just rare occasion that I get the opportunity to meet someone like you and be able to share the story.
Okay, you mentioned having another book in the percolator, so it's always going around even though you haven't done the writing.
Yeah.
Is that to come with the Tail Gunner?
There is a sequel, or I should say another episode in that story with that particular character. And as many stories are, they're about relationships. And this was about finding her grandfather, and the next one is about finding her father. And that one just isn't, it's not quite there yet because I just need to devote a lot more time to doing it.
That's one of the things that writers are often confronted with, how much time. And it keeps getting shorter and shorter, the time that we have sometimes. If a book club or other organization wanted to invite you to speak or have some of the exhibits there, how can they contact you?
Easiest way is through the Harbor History Museum.
Okay.
And all of our website address is very easy. It's just harborhistorymuseum.org, and then my contact information is available there.
And that website is in Gig Harbor.
Correct.
Right. Of the many hats that you wear, and I described some of them when we first started, which one is your favorite? I think you've said that during this conversation, but what would be your special plume in your special hat that you like to wear?
Well, for me, being a writer is by far the most energizing and exciting part of what I do. Because you can choose to be a writer or you can choose to be a whole bunch of other things. But when you're really committed to it and you're really committed to putting those words together in such a way that they inspire other people, very important work. So I would say that in my heart, that's the thing that I love the most and that really brings me energy and joy. I love doing museum work. I love all that. And in museum work, there's a common phrase where people say, tell the story. Tell the story. And one of the wonderful things about writing is show, not tell. And that's what we try to do at the Harbor History Museum. Our educational focus is about helping people try to find the story. And that was the focus of the history lab that we built at the Washington State History Museum as well. So helping people find the story is also, the other joy that I have. And that's why I do museum work.
I think you answered very carefully about what the plume is in your hat, but I think also that you've shown how writing isn't just a book printed out and put on a shelf. it's integrated in all the activities that you do. Somebody has to write the words that are exposed to that exhibit. Somebody has to write the words that are used for publicity. Somebody has to write the right words that encourage people to come and see these wonderful exhibits. And so writing is more than just the book, although I think a lot of us kind of make the book a special treat to have, because you can put it in your hands and such. But writing all of that is all such an integral part of it. On a personal, you already answered the personal note about organizing the craft and art. Stephanie, in 2020, we are approaching the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II. Many people and families find themselves with family heirlooms from that era. That generation is passing, and families have memorabilia, letters, pictures, stories, and objects. What would you suggest they do with these treasures?
Well, I think, first of all, assess them and learn as much as you can from them, because really understanding those objects leads you to a better understanding of the people that you love and that you care about, that fought for our country and gave us the freedom that we have today. It's really important. We have been doing some oral history interviews with some local World War II vets that are still with us. Most of them have passed on. And so it's really important to capture that information. If you have a family collection, then I would actually inventory the whole thing and get a better sense of what you know about that person, because every person served in a squadron or a bomb group or a bomb wing or whatever, and a lot of times when people inquire with me at the museum, I help them find that information. If you have letters or diaries, those are very precious objects and should be cared for properly with the right kind of archival materials and that sort of thing. If you feel compelled to donate those to a museum, there are museums that are looking for World War II collections, and they're looking for collections, not just one thing. But if you have an array of letters or you have a complete collection, it gives you a better sense, and any researcher that would come along in the future, a better sense of who that person was and what they were about. The Tail Gunner was a process of looking at this entire collection, from photographs to diary to, there was a train ticket that took him all the way across the country. And I was like, why in the world is that in here? And why did he keep it so long? It was the trip that he took from Washington State to South Dakota to Florida to see everyone in his family before he was shipped out overseas. And he actually changed his induction place from Puyallup, Washington to Florida so that he could go on that train trip and see his whole family. He had 14 brothers and sisters, and so seeing everybody was a big deal, because he really didn't know if he was going to come back. And when you look at the statistics, that's the next part of it. Once you know what you have, you look at the statistics and say, well, B-25s were manufactured to only survive 11 missions, the plane itself. So imagine the people. So he didn't know if he was coming back. So there's train tickets, there's photographs, there's diaries, and no matter what's in your collection, and even if you only have one last thing, try to find out as much as you can about it, because then you'll know when you go to donate it, if you choose to donate it, where the best repository is for that object. An example is, we just received the hat of a fellow from Gig Harbor that was his dress uniform hat. And his name was Daniel Chessman, and he was on our list of people from Gig Harbor who had served in World War II. And we're creating an honor wall as part of the Bomber Boys exhibit that will list all of these people. And he was listed as DNB. It means died or death non-battle. And only when we received that object from a family member of his who explained that he served his whole tour of duty, he came home, he was on his way to sign his decommission papers, and he was hit and killed by a car. And you just think, oh my gosh, that's the last thing of his wartime possessions that's around, and we have it in our collection, and we will be good stewards of that, and we will carry that story forward forever. That kind of thing is exactly the kind of thing that a museum wants to receive as part of their collection.
I know in research for my own father, who was in World War II and did not come home, he was killed in action, I found that just by going online, there was a website for his particular bomb group, and we filled in the name of his particular bomb group, and we had so much information given to us that had been accumulated, and it's mostly on site, although they do have reunions and they have meetings. This kind of information, everything to even the position my father's plane was in on the day he was shot down by flak, and all of that information that was totally absent to our family for over 50 years was there online, and you can still go there to see it, and it kind of lives in the Ethernet.
Yeah, there have been people who have been extremely generous in terms of sharing their collections online and sharing the information that they have about these things. I had someone contact me about a person in their family, and all she had was a photograph of him, and she said, I think it was in the 781st or something like that. And so I was able to actually find exactly which part of the Air Corps he was in, where he was stationed, and someone had put a whole Flickr page up of images from that time period, from where he was stationed, and I was able to send her that link, and she's like, we learned more about my dad from that than we ever knew before.
Thank you, Stephanie, for all that you do in the Stephosphere, which is all the whirling, swirling cosmic passions and the projects of Stephanie Lile, and coming out to record this program. It's always a pleasure to talk to you about the exciting events that you develop as an author, and we appreciate the viewers for tuning in to Bremerton Kitsap Access Television and viewing this Kitsap literary artists and writers production. I also wish to thank the BCAT staff on cameras and in the director's chair. Our broadcasts are scheduled for Saturday evenings at 6 p.m. on Wave Channel 3, Cable Channel 3, and Comcast Channel 12. Keep in touch with our Facebook and web pages to discover where you can meet local authors and artists. We are also available online streaming at the bcat.org website. Have a good week with wonderful books and a wonderful productive time. And this is J.W. Capek with Kitsap Literary Artists in Bremerton saying good night.